Chapter 2. Open the door. Dawn was only just breaking, and Chen Ping'an had already gotten up even before the roosters began to crow. His thin blanket didn't do a very good job of keeping him warm, and he had developed the habit of waking up early and going to bed late, back when he was learning to become a potter. He opened the door before stepping out onto the soft and loamy soil in the courtyard outside, then took a deep breath. After stretching out his body, he made his way out of the courtyard and turned to discover a thin and frail figure. It was none other than Song Jixin's maidservant, and she was huddled over, trying to open the gate of the neighboring courtyard with her shoulder while carrying a bucket of water with both hands. It seemed that she had just drawn some water from the iron lock well on Apricot Blossom Alley. Chen Ping'an withdrew his gaze as he jogged through a series of streets and alleys toward the eastern side of the small town. Clay Vase Alley was situated in the westernmost part of the town, and at the town gate in the easternmost part of the town was a man who was responsible for conducting nightly patrols and overseeing the merchants and visitors entering and exiting the town. On the side, he would also receive and deliver some letters sent to the town, and Chen Ping'an's job was to take those letters and deliver them to the town's residents for 1 copper coin per letter. This was an avenue of income that he had gone to great lengths to obtain, and it had already been arranged that he was going to be taking over this job after the day of the Longtaitu festival. In Song Jixin's words, Chen Ping'an was destined to lead an impoverished life, and even if the winds of fortune were to blow into his home, he wouldn't be able to keep them anyway. Song Jixin often said some things that were very difficult to understand. He most likely took those esoteric sayings from the books that he read, and Chen Ping'an was frequently left scratching his head in befuddlement. For example, a few days ago, Song Jixin had been saying something along the lines of, "Beware of the spring chill, for it has been the death of many a young man," and Chen Ping'an had no idea what that meant. However, he had first-hand experience with the strange phenomenon where the initial period of spring felt colder than the winter each year. Song Jixin referred to this phenomenon as the unexpected spring chill, which caught many people off guard before claiming their lives, much like a sudden and unforeseen retaliation from an opponent on the battlefield. The town wasn't surrounded by any walls, so even bandits and gangs were a problem, let alone petty thieves. The so-called town gate was actually nothing more than a row of old and uneven fencing materials, acting as a makeshift checkpoint for people and carriages to pass through in order to keep up appearances for the town. While jogging past Apricot Blossom Alley, Chen Ping'an spotted many women and children huddled around the iron lock well, and the well winch was creaking incessantly. After passing through another street, Chen Ping'an heard the familiar sound of reading ringing out nearby. There was a private school there, and it was jointly funded by several of the most affluent clans in the town. The teacher was from out of town, and back in Chen Ping'an's younger days, he would often squat down outside the window and listen to the lesson being taught in secret. The teacher was very strict during classes, but he never called out or got in the way of freeloaders like Chen Ping'an. After that, Chen Ping'an traveled out of the town to become a disciple at a dragon kiln, and he hadn't visited the school since then. Jogging ahead a bit further, Chen Ping'an passed by a stone archway. Due to the fact that the archway was supported by 12 stone pillars, the local residents liked to refer to it as the Crab Archway. As for what the archway's actual name was, Song Jixin and Liu Xianyang had very different accounts. Song Jixin swore that he had read in an old book by the name of local county chronicles that the archway was called the Grand Secretary Archway, and that it had been bestowed upon the town by the emperor at the time to commemorate an official in history who had made significant contributions in overseeing military forces. In contrast, Liu Xianyang was just as much of a hillbilly as Chen Ping'an, and he insisted that this place was known as the Crab Archway. It had been referred to as such for several centuries, and in his eyes there was no reason to give it a nonsensical name like the Grand Secretary Archway. In addition to that, Liu Xianyang had also posed a question to Song Jixin. How big is the official hat of a Grand Secretary? Is it bigger than the opening of the iron lock well? Song Jixin had no answer to this, and he was left flushing furiously with embarrassment. Chen Ping'an ran a lap around the 12-pillar archway, and each side bore 4 large characters inscribed in strange fonts, all of which appeared to be different from one another. The inscriptions read, "Doing my part," comply with the natural order, refrain from looking outward, and unmatched aura. According to Song Jixin, aside from one of those inscriptions, all three of the other inscriptions had been smeared or altered at some point. Chen Ping'an was quite clueless about these matters, and he had never given this notion much deep thought. Of course, even if he had wanted to unearth some answers, he wouldn't have been able to. Even now, he still didn't know what kind of book the local county chronicles that Song Jixin frequently mentioned was supposed to be. Shortly after passing the archway, he saw an old yet lush locust tree, at the foot of which was a tree trunk that had been moved there by someone. Slight modifications had been made to the tree trunk, and there were two bluestone slabs tucked under either end of it, transforming it into a crude bench. Every summer, all of the town's residents liked to gather under the tree to stay cool. Some of the adults from the wealthier clans would pull baskets of chilled fruits and melons out of the well for the children to eat, and once they'd had their fill of fruits, the children would band together and play under the shade of the tree. Chen Ping'an was already accustomed to rigorous travel, so he wasn't even out of breath as he jogged over to the makeshift town gate before stopping at the entrance of the lone earthen cabin. Not many outsiders visited the town. Now that the town had been deprived of a major source of income in the form of the official kilns, it stood to reason that there would be even fewer visitors from outside. Back when Old Man Yao was around, there was one time when he had a little too much to drink, and he told his disciples, including Chen Ping'an and Liu Xianyang, that they were the only ones under the heavens manning official kilns, that the Chinaware that they produced was imperial ware used by the emperor and the empress, that no matter how rich or lofty in official status someone was, they would be beheaded if they dared to use imperial ware themselves. On that day, Old Man Yao had seemed like a completely different person. As Chen Ping'an cast his gaze out of the town gate, he was surprised to discover that there were 7 or 8 people waiting outside, and there were people of both genders and all ages among them. Furthermore, they were all unfamiliar to him. The local residents very rarely went through the eastern gate, regardless of whether they were tending to their fields or going to their kilns. The reason for this was very simple. The path leading out of the town's eastern gate didn't lead to any kilns or plots of farmland. At this moment, Chen Ping'an and these outsiders were looking across at each other, separated by the makeshift gate. Chen Ping'an was wearing a pair of straw sandals, woven by himself, and he was very envious of the thick clothing worn by the people outside. In his eyes, the clothes looked very warm and were sure to be great for keeping out the cold. The people outside the town gate were clearly split up into several groups, rather than belonging to one large group, but all of them wore aloof and indifferent expressions as they looked at Chen Ping'an. A couple of them had already looked past him and were peering further into the town. Chen Ping'an was rather perplexed to see this. Could it be that these people weren't aware that the imperial court had already shut down all of the dragon kilns in the village? Alternatively, could it be that they felt like there was an opportunity to be exploited here because they knew the true reason for the closure of the kilns? There was a young man wearing a strange tall hat in the group. He was tall and slim, with a green jade pendant hanging from his waist, and he seemed to have grown tired of waiting. The gate had no lock, and he emerged from the crowd on his own as if he were going to push it open. But right as his finger was about to come into contact with the gate, he suddenly stopped before slowly withdrawing his hand, then clasped his hands behind his back as he cast his gaze toward Chen Ping'an with a smile on his face. He didn't say anything. All he did was smile. Out of his peripheral vision, Chen Ping'an inadvertently noticed that the people behind the young man seemed to all be displaying different emotions. Some were disappointed, some were amused, some had their brows furrowed, and some were looking on with derision in their eyes. Right at this moment, a middle-aged man with a head of disheveled hair abruptly opened the gate, then erupted into a loud tirade directed at Chen Ping'an. "How desperate for money are you, you little bastard? Who in their right mind would come here at such an ungodly hour? Are you rushing off to reunite with your dead parents?" Chen Ping'an rolled his eyes in response, completely unfazed by the man's scathing words. He was living in a rural area filled with uneducated people. If he allowed himself to get mad every time someone directed some insults at him, then he might as well jump into a well and put himself out of his misery. In addition, this middle-aged gatekeeper was often the butt of jokes for the residents of the town himself. In particular, the bold and feisty women would not just verbally abuse him, but often hit him as well. The man was also always going around boasting to little kids who were still in their open crotch pants, telling them about how back in his heyday, he had once beaten up 5 or 6 burly men at once in front of the town gate, dishing out such a severe beating that his assailants were left to pick up their teeth from the ground, and that there was so much blood everywhere that the entire 20-foot wide path in front of the town gate had become as muddy as if it had just rained. "We'll discuss your shitty job later," the man said to Chen Ping'an in a disgruntled voice. No one in the town held any respect for him, but he was the one who decided whether outsiders could enter the town or not. He made his way toward the makeshift gati while reaching a hand down into his own pants. His back was facing Chen Ping'an, and after opening the door, he would take a small embroidered pouch from each of the people outside, then stow the pouches up his sleeve before granting them passage into the town. Chen Ping'an had already stepped aside to let the people through, and the 8 outsiders made their way into the town, roughly split up into 5 groups. 2 children who were around 7 or 8 years of age strode into the town on either side of the young man with the green jade pendant strapped to his waist. The pair of children consisted of a boy and a girl, and the former was wearing a festive red robe, while the little girl was as fair and delicate as a piece of premium porcelain. The boy was almost a full head shorter than Chen Ping'an, and as he passed by Chen Ping'an, he opened his mouth but didn't say anything. However, it was quite apparent that he had mouthed something very rude and provocative. The middle-aged woman, holding on to the boy's hand, cleared her throat quietly, and only then did the boy display some restraint. As for the little girl behind the boy and the woman, she was being led by a physically imposing elderly man with a head of white hair. She turned to Chen Ping'an and immediately began chatting away while pointing at the boy up ahead. Chen Ping'an couldn't understand anything that she was saying, but he could tell that she was complaining about the boy. The burly old man took a glance at Chen Ping'an out of the corner of his eye, and it was only a fleeting glance without any intention or malice. But Chen Ping'an reflexively took a step backward, as if he were a mouse that had run into a cat. The chatty little girl's enthusiasm was instantly snuffed out upon seeing this, and she turned away from Chen Ping'an without affording him so much as a second glance, as if looking at him would be an insult to her eyes. Chen Ping'an didn't have much life experience, but he wasn't so clueless that he couldn't read faces. After those people had faded into the distance, the gatekeeper turned to Chen Ping'an before asking, "Do you want to know what they said?" "I do," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. The middle-aged gatekeeper chuckled. "They were praising you for your good looks. They were all saying good things about you." Chen Ping'an gave a wry smile in response. "Do I look stupid to you?" The gatekeeper could tell what Chen Ping'an was thinking, and he began to laugh even more boisterously. "If you weren't stupid, I wouldn't have asked you to come and deliver letters." Chen Ping'an didn't dare to rebuke the gatekeeper for fear of irking him and losing this job. The gatekeeper turned and cast his gaze toward the outsiders, stroking his stubbly chin as he mused to himself, "That woman just now had a pair of killer legs." Chen Ping'an hesitated momentarily before asking with an intrigued expression, "Is she a martial arts practitioner?" The gatekeeper was rather taken aback by this innocent response, and he turned to Chen Ping'an with a serious expression as he said, "You really are a stupid kid." Chen Ping'an was still none the wiser. The gatekeeper asked Chen Ping'an to wait outside as he made his way into the cabin, then re-emerged with a stack of letters in his hand. It wasn't a particularly thick stack, consisting of only around 10 letters, and the man handed the letters over to Chen Ping'an before asking, "It said that fortune favors the foolish and karma favors the righteous. Do you believe in that?" Chen Ping'an grabbed the letters with one hand while spreading open his other hand, blinking innocently as he said, "You promised me 1 copper coin per letter." The gatekeeper pulled out the 5 copper coins that he had prepared earlier in a disgruntled fashion before slamming them down heavily onto Chen Ping'an's palm, then gave him a dismissive wave as he said, "I'll give you the remaining 5 copper coins some other time." Chapter 3. Sunrise. The town wasn't very large, home to fewer than 700 clans, and Chen Ping'an knew the majority of the impoverished clans in the town. As for the wealthy clans, they were too far above a poor hillbilly like him. In fact, Chen Ping'an hadn't even set foot in any of the wide and spacious alleys where some of the wealthy clans resided in clusters. Those streets were mostly paved with large bluestone slabs, so there was no risk of having to slosh through mud even on rainy days. After centuries of being trodden on by people, horses, and carriages, the high-quality bluestone slabs had already been polished to the point that they were as smooth as mirrors. Lu, Li, Zhao, and Song were the most prominent surnames in the town, and it was those clans who had pooled together the funds to open the private school. Each of those clans owned 2 or 3 large dragon kilns outside the town, and all of the past kiln supervision officials had lived on the same street as them. Coincidentally, almost all 10 letters that Chen Ping'an had been tasked with delivering were addressed to the renowned affluent clans in the town. However, this was quite a reasonable occurrence. As the saying went, the offspring of dragons and phoenixes were destined to soar in the heavens, while the offspring of mice could only burrow in the dirt. Those who were traveling far away and were able to send letters back to their families had to have come from privileged backgrounds. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had the courage and financial backing to go to such faraway places. For 9 of the 10 letters, Chen Ping'an only had to go to 2 places, namely Fortune Deer Street and Peachleaf Alley. The bluestone slabs that paved these streets were as large as bedsteads, and he felt rather uneasy as he stepped onto them for the first time. He unconsciously slowed down and was struck by a sense of inferiority, feeling as if he were soiling the ground with his straw sandals. The first letter that he delivered was to the Lu clan, which had an ancestor who had received a jade scepter bestowed upon them by the emperor. As he stood outside the doors of the Lu manor, he was becoming more and more agitated and uneasy. Wealthy clans were very particular about many things. Not only was the Lu manor massive, there were 2 stone lions placed on either side of the entrance, both of which were as tall as a grown man, presenting a rather intimidating sight to behold. According to Song Jixin, these things were capable of warding off malicious and evil entities. Chen Ping'an had no idea what these malicious and evil entities were supposed to be. He was only very intrigued by the round stone ball that each of the stone lions held in their mouths, wondering how those balls had been sculpted. He forcibly suppressed the urge to touch those stone balls, then made his way up the steps before using the bronze lion head knockers on the doors. A young man quickly made his way out of the manor, and upon hearing that Chen Ping'an was here to deliver a letter, the man pinched a corner of the letter between 2 of his fingers and took it from Chen Ping'an in an expressionless manner. He then quickly strode back into the manor before closing the doors, which bore a colourful visage of the god of wealth. The letter delivery process after this proved to be just as mundane and uneventful. On the corner of Peachleaf Alley was a lesser-known clan, and Chen Ping'an was greeted by a benevolent-looking old man of a rather short and small stature. The man accepted the letter with a smile, then said, "You're working hard, young lad. Would you like to come in for some rest and a sip of warm water?" Chen Ping'an shook his head with a bashful smile in response before jogging away. The old man gently tucked the letter into his sleeve, but instead of returning to his courtyard right away, he raised his head and cast a pair of slightly murky eyes into the distance. He looked up, then down, then peered into the distance before withdrawing his gaze, staring at the peach trees that lined the street, following which a faint smile appeared on his face. The old man turned to depart, and shortly thereafter, a small oriole with adorable colors landed on the tip of one of the peach tree's branches, chirping gently as it did so. The final letter that Chen Ping'an had to deliver was addressed to the teacher at the private school. Along the way, he passed by a fortune-teller's stall, where a young Taoist priest in an old Taoist robe was seated behind a table with his back ramrod straight. He was wearing a tall hat that resembled a blooming lotus flower. Right as Chen Ping'an was jogging past, the young Taoist priest hurriedly called out to him, "Don't miss out on a reading, young man. Pick out a stick and I'll tell your fortune. I can help you predict whether fortune or peril awaits you." Chen Ping'an continued to jog past without pause, but he turned to the Taoist priest and waved a hand in refusal. The Taoist priest was unwilling to give up, and he leaned forward slightly as he raised his voice and continued, "How about this, young man? I normally charge 10 copper coins for a reading, but today I'll make an exception and only charge you 3 copper coins. Of course, if you pick out a good stick, you're free to pay a little extra for good fortune. Even if you're fortunate enough to pick out the best stick possible, I'll only charge you 5 copper coins. What do you say?" Chen Ping'an had already jogged into the distance at this point, but he clearly faltered slightly in his footsteps. The young Taoist priest instantly jumped on the opportunity, quickly rising to his feet as he declared, "It's still very early in the morning, so you'll be my first customer, young man. In light of that, I'll do you an additional favor. If you sit down for a reading, I'll write up some yellow paper talismans for you and help you pray to your ancestors so you can accumulate some good karma. With my skills, I wouldn't dare to guarantee that you'll be reincarnated into a wealthy clan in your next life, but I can certainly try and bless you with a bit of good fortune." Chen Ping'an faltered slightly upon hearing this, then turned back around with a skeptical expression before taking a seat on the bench in front of the stall. Thus, a modest Taoist priest and an impoverished young man found themselves seated across from one another, each of them just as poor as the other. The Taoist priest smiled as he extended a hand, inviting Chen Ping'an to pick up the tube of bamboo sticks. However, Chen Ping'an didn't hesitate even for a moment as he declared, "I don't want to draw a stick. All I want is for you to write up a yellow paper talisman for me. Can you do that?" Chen Ping'an recalled that this young traveling Taoist priest had already been staying in this town for at least the past 5 or 6 years. His appearance hadn't changed much during that time, and he was always quite friendly to everyone. On a normal day, all he did was tell people's fortunes through scapulomancy, face reading, and stick drawing, and he also occasionally acted as a letter ghostwriter for others. What was rather interesting was that there were 108 bamboo sticks in the tube on the table, but during all his time here, not a single person had managed to draw the best possible stick, nor had anyone ever drawn a stick of misfortune. It was as if there were only good or neutral sticks in the tube, with no other options available. Hence, whenever there was a festival, the residents of the town were willing to fork out 10 copper coins for a fortune reading purely for the sake of good fortune. However, no one experiencing any actual troubles would be willing to come here just to be scalped. It would be unfair to say that the Taoist priest was a complete and utter fraud. The town was not a very large place, and if all he did was intentionally confuse and defraud people, then he would have been kicked out long ago. Hence, it was clear that the young Taoist priest's forte wasn't his fortune-telling. Instead, he had made a name for himself through his amulet water, which had consistently cured many of the town's residents of various minor ailments over the years. The young Taoist priest shook his head in response. "I never go back on my word. I promised that I was going to give you a fortune reading and a yellow paper talisman for 5 copper coins." "It's 3 copper coins," Chen Ping'an argued in a low voice. "But it'll be 5 copper coins if you manage to pull the best stick." The Taoist priest chuckled. After making up his mind, Chen Ping'an reached out for the stick tube, only to suddenly raise his head as he asked, "How did you know that I just so happened to have exactly 5 copper coins on me?" The Taoist priest replied with a serious expression, "I can see if someone is blessed by fortune or not, and in particular, I've always been very accurate when it comes to my readings of one's fortune in wealth." After a brief moment of contemplation, Chen Ping'an picked up the stick tube. The Taoist priest smiled as he said, "Don't be nervous, young man. If it's meant to be, then it'll be. If it's not meant to be, then it can't be forced. Regarding impermanence with a peaceful heart is the solution to everything." Chen Ping'an set the stick tube back down onto the table, then asked with a serious expression, "How about this? I'll give you the 5 copper coins, and I won't draw a stick. All that I ask is that you write up the yellow paper talisman a bit better than you normally do. Is that possible?" The Taoist priest's smile remained unchanged, and after some thought, he nodded in response. "Sure." A set of writing tools and paper had already been prepared on the table, and the Taoist priest carefully inquired to Chen Ping'an about the names, birthplaces, and birth dates and times of his parents, then pulled out a yellow paper talisman before quickly inscribing something onto it. As for what had been written, Chen Ping'an had no clue. The young Taoist priest set down his brush before picking up the talisman, then blew on it to dry the ink. "Take this home, and all you have to do is burn this outside your doorway while standing inside your doorway." Chen Ping'an accepted the talisman with a solemn expression, then carefully stowed it away as if it were a priceless treasure. He then placed 5 copper coins down onto the table before bowing in gratitude. The Taoist priest waved a dismissive hand, indicating that Chen Ping'an was free to go, and he immediately rushed away to deliver the final letter. The Taoist priest sat back lazily in his chair, then took a glance at the copper coins before bending over and scooping them close to him. Right at this moment, a small oriole flew down from the sky onto the table, gently pecking one of the copper coins before quickly losing interest and flying away again. The oriole wishes to pluck a flower, but the peach blossoms are still yet to bloom. After casually reciting that poem phrase to himself, he rustled his sleeve in a carefree manner as he sighed, "If it's not meant to be, then there's no point in forcing things." As he rustled his sleeve, 2 bamboo sticks fell out from within before clattering onto the ground. The Taoist priest yelped in alarm as he hurriedly picked up the bamboo sticks, then looked around in a sheepish manner and was very relieved to see that no one had caught sight of what had just happened. After that, he tucked the pair of bamboo sticks back into his loose and baggy sleeve. He then cleared his throat and put on a serious expression, waiting for his next customer. At the same time, he couldn't help but muse to himself that it was easier to get women to spend money on things like this. As it turned out, there were 2 bamboo sticks concealed up the Taoist priest's sleeve, one of which was the best possible stick, while the other was the worst possible stick, and both of them were reserved for earning big money. However, he never revealed this to anyone, and Chen Ping'an was naturally oblivious to these hidden machinations as well. He jogged lightly to the private school, and there was a lush and vibrant bamboo forest nearby. He slowed down outside the school, and the mellow voice of a middle-aged man rang out from inside. "The radiant sun shines down upon the pristine woolen coat." The phrase was immediately repeated in unison by a collection of tender voices. "The radiant sun shines down upon the pristine woolen coat." Chen Ping'an raised his head to find that the sun was only just beginning to rise in the east, and he was momentarily dazed. By the time he returned to his senses, he discovered that the children in the school were reciting a passage in a well-rehearsed manner as instructed by the teacher. "At the time of Jingzhe, heaven and earth stirs, and all living things begin to flourish. Sleep late and wake early, take regular strolls. Do so slowly for good health and vitality." Chen Ping'an was standing at the entrance of the school, and he wanted to say something, but refrained from doing so. The teacher was a middle-aged scholar with grey sideburns, and he gently made his way out of the room. Chen Ping'an offered the letter to him with both hands as he said in a respectful voice, "I have a letter for you, sir." The man accepted the letter, then encouraged in a warm voice, "If you have some free time, you can come here and listen to my lessons." Chen Ping'an was reluctant to make any promises. He couldn't guarantee that he would have the time to come and listen to these lessons, and he didn't want to lie to the teacher. The man gave a considerate smile as he said, "It's all right. The knowledge is all in the books, but the way to be a good person is something that needs to be learned outside of books. You can go now." Chen Ping'an heaved a faint sigh of relief before taking his leave. After a while, he was struck by the urge to turn back for some reason, even though he was already very far away from the school. The teacher was still standing at the entrance, basking under the sunlight, resembling a deity from afar.